Okay, so I referenced this idea. That was the one that I had up right as I got going here. This leading a nonprofit organization is often like spinning straw into gold. And this comes off of an article that was written by a guy named Bob Crittenden back in 2000. I got the citation for it in a couple of slides up. And it really came from nonprofit practitioners. And they talked about strategy and the way that they were framing what they were doing and the way they thought about it. And I remember the first time I heard this, I was like, right, Rumpelstiltskin, what's going on, right? So it's this, but this idea that you gather up potentially not useless, but potentially disparate pieces, disparate components, and that you're able to take those things, whether it's volunteers, whether it's a small grant that you got, whether it's some initiative that you have. You take all of these kind of pieces, and oftentimes you can't fully control what the nature of the straw either, right? But a manager then is able to take some of that stuff and I don't want to say, that turn it into gold, or turn it into magic, but there is a bit of magistry or magicness element to it, of being able to sort of pull it together when you watch somebody who's a good leader and a good manager, being able to draw these three streams together. And then when you see what happens when the organization is able to achieve its objective, have the kind of impact that you want it to try and be able to have, you're like, wow, that's kind of an amazing, how did they bring all that together? So strategy is an attempt to talk about both the gathering of the straw, if you will, and the process of weaving it together to achieve the kind of impact that you want to be able to have. So I'm going to reference that a couple of times and use it for what it's worth. I also managed to slip in quite a few quotes today for some reason. I'm not quite sure why. I couldn't help myself. I just kept grabbing them. I threw out a couple before I came in here. So today I got plenty I want to talk about. I want to give you some definitions. I want to talk about different ways of thinking about planning and then recognizing the strategy as a process or planning as a process. Give you a couple of models. One of the things I expose people to are a variety of models that help me grapple with this complex idea. Mintzberg talks a lot about strategy as a lot like a sort of an elephant, and we're all a little bit blindfolded, and our attempt to try and understand exactly what's going on with our organization. We have limited range of understanding, and so I try to lay out a couple of models that give us partial truth or partial access to what's going on. And then I'm going to get into the key components of recognizing what happens inside our organization is operating within an external environment. And then I want to give you a couple of tools. So you're going to be familiar with the SWOT perhaps, but I also expose you to this idea of the competing values framework and a portfolio analysis. So the hope is that you'll be able to distinguish. So two main ideas that I want you to be able to come away with today has to do with the levels and this recognition that there's a strategy formation process, that there's this process of deciding what we're going to do, and then there's a strategy in regards to how we're going to get it done, the implementation process. So that distinction for me, it came to me, and it was really an important distinction, whether we're thinking about, in some sense, creating a plan to implement a program, or we're making a decision to be able to, or thinking about the kinds of programs we should implement, formation versus implementation. So that's a pretty critical idea, and I hope that you can get that by the end of the day today, or the end of the session today, and be able to consider when you're engaged in one versus the other. And I think there can be back and forth. There inevitably is. The other thing is this related to the inside and outside. Recognizing how features or characteristics of our organization interact with aspects of the external environment, and that we use strategy and planning to help us be able to think about the way we run our organization inside, but we also think about how we run our organization in the external environment, how we deliver our programs, how we communicate and market to the external constituencies, and those kinds of things. And then in addition, I'll give you a couple of tools that could be useful to navigate some of that stuff as we go forward. How are we doing? Oh, I'm just 10 minutes in. Good. So another quote. I told you I was going to expose you to too many of those. So this is a Tom Peters. So this is corporate, right? So the guy who wrote the In Search of Excellence book, talking about how organizations are framed. But the reason I picked it, right, is I kind of like this initial reference here, this first one. Amateurs talk about strategy and professionals talk about logistics. So again, this was an attempt to try and make this distinction between, are we out in the clouds, right? So the formation component. And the second one reiterates that same idea, right? So Welsh, so this is all dated stuff. Tom Peters comes back quite a bit. But this idea that if we can just pick a general direction, if we have a general purpose for our organization, which many of us do with our nonprofits, we have our mission, we have our objectives, we have some sense of who we are and what we're supposed to be doing, helping a particular constituency, addressing a particular inequity, whatever it is. And then this recognition that a lot of our work really comes down to building it and putting it in place and making it work. And that's where a lot of the effort needs to get put. And strategy reflects both those two ideas. How do we figure out which direction we're going to go, and how are we going to make sure we can get it delivered in a way that's useful for our organization? So I'm going to give you a couple of thoughts here about sort of planning as a model, as the ways we can think about planning, different types of planning, and it partially reflects this distinction between formation versus implementation, or operations versus strategizing for vision and mission and overall purposes for our organization. And for those of you who've sat in my sessions before know I reference this idea that I'm a simple-minded guy, right? So I like my little simple models. I like simplicity because it does help me, even though it limits, it constrains the truth, so to speak, it gives us a window into some of it. So this idea of a very basic model, let's see if I can get my pen to work here. I'm going to give it a shot. This basic model basically has in my mind, has two components to it. It has these two on this end, which is this idea of deciding what it is we want to try and be able to achieve. What's our vision and what are our goals, right? So that's the strategy formation component. And then the second thing having to do with, I probably should give up on the pen, but the second thing having to do with our approach. What is that? Oh, it jumped. I won't worry about it. I'll stop that. Having to do with our approach or the actions or the implementation of those initiatives. So it has this really, so basic. What is it that you're trying to get done? How are you going to get it done? But that basic idea of planning undergirds a lot of what we talk about. Right? So clarifying, are we going to have a conversation about what we're trying to do? Or are we having a conversation about how we're going to get there? That is that key distinction that I wanted to play around with. So a couple of more models that I wanted to recognize as well. And I gave you a citation here for this guy types up 20 of them, right? So there's a lot of different ways people think about strategy. I really think that basic model actually can serve quite well in the fundamentals. I know the details unpack and then look a lot trickier than that. So this one here, this issue-based model, it's a little bit what we were doing 2 years ago, right? All of a sudden we saw something going on and we realized that we were going to be stuck at home, but we had to figure out what we're going to do and how we're going to get it done. And so we are oriented toward the present. We put in place, we had particular initiatives that we had to do. We identified the major challenges that confronted us, and we were making short-term plans. What are we going to do for the next? Well, sometimes it was weeks, months, but it was a short-term focus. Tended to be internally, right? There wasn't a whole heck of a lot we could do with what was going on in the external environment. So it was really a responsive model, right? So issue-based a lot of times are responsive, and you probably have engaged in some of that version of planning before, where you're just simply looking at what's the problem, let's put in place some strategies, let's pull together. Sometimes you meet quite often, meet a lot, and make some determinations about what are we going to do and how are we going to get it done. This organic model is also one that I see a lot in nonprofit organizations. I think we've been implementing some version of this at the center for quite a while. So we had some idea of what we wanted to accomplish. You heard our mission. You heard some of we didn't necessarily have a vision, but we have a written vision that was kind of like we're going to have an impact and make a difference for organizations so that they can achieve their objectives. Some version of that. And we then started looking around. Basically what you do is you start self-organizing or looking around. And what we did is we looked inside, right? Again, it's a bit more of an inside framework. We looked inside our organizations and we said, what can we do? What capabilities do we have? What resources do we have? How can we deliver these in a way that's reasonable? So it's while we had this broad objective, we knew that there were a lot of ways to go about it. And so we just allowed whatever way developed. Oh, there's Pepper. He's going to join us. That's nice. That's also appropriate. This recognition that you can sort of look around and just kind of let things be and let the elements of the organization come about. And you can achieve quite a bit, right? If you can align people's objectives around a common vision or a common purpose, you can identify those different components and achieve quite a bit, right? But what happens is you end up with a lot of disparate pieces. Sometimes they're not coordinated together, so that has to do with this other model here, this idea of an alignment model, right? Is that at some point you start realizing, oh my gosh, I got to be able to connect all of these different pieces in my organization that have kind of grown up and come about because of what they were. And so we got to try and figure out how we're going to align those in a way to be able to be more efficient, to be more, to achieve our objectives more capably, to reduce the redundancies and the frustrations that people might experience in our organization. So this can be quite a bit of work for organizations as well. And I'm sure folks today have different objectives in reference to what they may want to be trying to accomplish with the planning process. And it has to do with both who you are as an organization and where you're at and where you've come from. And you also, in reference to what's happening in the external environment, right? This last one is one I don't see implemented a lot, but it is a nice idea, and certainly coming out of crisis, there's some recognition that perhaps we should be considering alternative scenarios, right? So we've all heard of stories when a major beneficiary for an organization decides that they're no longer going to engage in an organization. And have you put in place some backups, more or less walked through some of those narratives of, you know, I mean, nobody could have walked through the narrative of what happens if you have a global pandemic, but we could have walked through what happens if there were different kinds of scenarios, and we might have been able to help our organizations prepare. I was with actually a credit union group shortly before going into the major financial crisis that was going on. This was back in the early 90s, right? Or the 2000, excuse me, so late 90s. So this idea that they could benefit from working through differing scenarios. So this can be a nice way sometimes for boards to engage in a conversation, especially if you're feeling pretty good about where your organization sits now. You're happy with the strategy priorities that you put in place. You're happy with the programs that you have in place and the way that they work and the way that they deliver quality for the people who participate in them. Well, then let's spend some time thinking about some alternative scenarios and our likelihood to be successful, to succeed and mitigate some of those. So that can be a useful process as well. Now, I'm going to talk a lot about any one of those a lot today. I'm going to go back into kind of some basic stuff. A quick reminder, right? So this is the citation for the Crittenton article, which is the spinning straw into gold. And it's this tenuous, so he calls it, right, the tenuous strategy, which is funding and financial and programs and the way that those things fit together. So just briefly, his conclusion of that work was a recognition that most of the successful organizations, and he looked at them in regards to achieving both impact and financial success. So coming back to this, the title, right? Both sustainability and program success. So we're both achieving the objectives we want to try and be able to achieve, and we're helping the people, and we're be able to do it in a way that we can sustain our operations. He found some of these things as being present. So there was some sense of coherence amongst the program portfolio, the way we were serving a particular constituency or group. So if you think about a food bank, right, might say, okay, we can serve a particular set of individuals, and you can think about the range of things that they may try to do to reinforce that, the extent to which those pieces make sense and coordinate and link together and address something in commonality, that tended to be reflective, as opposed to 6 different kind of random programs that didn't have any connectedness to each other per se. Similarly, there was an orientation toward finance, recognizing the importance of a diverse revenue base with a clear fundraising target and objective in order to try and be able to increase some fundraising success. They were market oriented in the sense that they attended to the external environment and were aware of what was going on around them. And this last one, again, having to do with thinking about the depth of services. So they oftentimes provided a full range of services as opposed to finding new people to serve, right? So if you come back to the food bank example, you think about the people that are already coming in and taking the packages, and you say, what else do those individuals need that we might be able to provide for them? So we've had those conversations before as well, but that's a useful way to remind ourselves, or should we all of a sudden now go off and work with a different population? And some of his research suggested the ones he saw tended to have a coherence in programs serving a particular constituency or client base. And as he references there, if you have none of that, right? So this lack of these things, lack of direction, this clear inability to be able to execute and deliver programs, you're really frustrating and burning people out in your organization. And so you want to try and, while we do responsive planning like some of those other models, ultimately we got to come back and make sure we're doing the right thing. All right, so you'll pardon me as I put up this one model. So this is a little bit generic in some ways. A shout out to my colleague Dave Rentz up at Kansas City. But it makes this reference to a couple of key ideas that I like, right? Is this strategy formation component up here and strategy implementation. So if you think about some of the decisions that need to be made in organizations about our mission, our vision, or our values, or our long-term goals, or key strategies or areas of work that we might be engaged in, that's what this is recognition, and that we kind of make conversations or discussions up at this top end. And then the importance of budgets slipped in here. I think a lot of people don't align necessarily budgets with strategic priorities. So if we've made a determination that we're going to try and grow, so we're working with a group who serves the elderly population, and so, if they make a determination, okay, we want to try and figure out how we're going to serve more of these individuals. If they make a determination they want to try and be able to do more in-home services or in-home care, right? So what are the budget implications associated with that, and what's the allocation of resources to grow a particular new kind of service or initiative? Or if they made a determination, well, we've been serving in this geographic region, we should try to serve in this geographic region as well. What are the budget implications? So it's important that that you kind of make a commitment, because if you make decisions up here without a clear commitment and a clear set of really financial commitments, then, or resource commitments at some point, then this is wasted, right? Because then if these things don't fit or don't align with what's going on, our organizations are nowhere near this linear. But if there has to be some element of this for us to be able to get a handle on what's going on with our organizations and the way that they operate. So this is the implementation side, right? So which programs, what activities are we going to specifically do? How are we going to deliver those things? What's the nature of being able to do that? And can we talk with confidence about the performance that we're doing? So many of us are engaged in these kinds of planning activities. And that's what this is an attempt to try and be able to recognize, is that you can have these sets of elements down here operating within these, right? And so sometimes our planning process is attending to these ideas, and sometimes our planning processes are attending to these ideas. I think the next one has to do, oh, there we go. So I said focusing in some of our attention on those level conversations can be pretty important, especially for board members and for individuals, making sure that so this gets to the next quote, when you'll pardon me, right? So doing the right things versus doing things right versus doing the right things, right? So again, this is one more time making this inference around, are we implementing our programs, doing things right? Or are we, in formation, are we doing the right things? Have we made the right choices about where we want to be able to go? So that's that key piece that I was hoping we could be able to get at. So implementation versus formation. And that idea is being sort of key to what a planning process. Okay, so I've done that quite a bit. Let's get into some of the planning components. Planning is a process by which we try to engage constituents in making decisions, making strategic decisions about the direction in our future. So, real simple idea that I think is still useful is this idea that we have the process is three very simple components. What is it that you're trying to achieve? So if you think back to that layer diagram, is it the stuff at the top end? Or are we trying to be able to think about program plans and program strategies and program efforts, right? So both are fine, both are good, both are reasonable planning elements. You just should be clear on where we're at and what we're trying to be able to achieve through our planning process. So that's sort of rule number one, clarify what it is that you want to try and be able to achieve, and don't try to achieve too much, right? So we've been engaged in a process, and they were like, well, last year we spent a lot of time talking about our mission and our vision and our long-term goals. So if you can help us with some of our strategies and some of our work plans and some of our objectives to be able to think about how we deliver those, that's helping us move our organization forward. And then the planning process is really thinking about what kind of information or what kind of framing do we need to go into this to be able to facilitate somebody's ability to be able to have interesting conversations and discussions so that they can inform and guide the development of these components, right? And it can be any variety of these kinds of ideas, and some of the tools that I'm going to talk about here give you some of these ideas. So I'm going to try, let's see if I can do this. Where is it? How come I can't see it? Rebecca, can you guys blow up do one of those polls?
Give me just a second and we'll.
Sorry, I don't know why I can't see it.
Okay, I can. Are you doing the, is this one
audience
the
interaction here for a moment?
Is this the experience?
Yeah.
Okay.
Give it a shot. If you guys don't mind, just take a minute. And so it says, what experience have you had with strategic planning? Almost none, quite a bit. There you go. You guys know what you're doing. Thanks, Rebecca. Fun. They don't see the results. We get to see them as they're going along. Huh? All right. So we'll let you go for a few more minutes. Looks like we got most of the folks in there. Anybody else want to jump in there? A couple more minutes. Couple more going. Audience interaction. Wake you up. I talked too much already. Go for it. Should we click the? Should we show them? If we click the show them, right? That's what comes next if I hit end. There we go. Thank you. So you can see it. So we've got some folks who are not a ton of experience. Nobody's saying they're advanced, which is great. I'm glad I'm here. I'm able to a few folks, whatever that was, 7 or 8%, 10%. Some experience. The rest of you, some of this is stuff you hadn't seen much of, and of course most of you are saying I've just got just a little experience, and probably at one level versus another. Go ahead and throw up the second question is a little bit based upon some of the experiences that you've had. So the second question is, let's see, I can even do that, I think. There we go. There we go. So this is the value question. What value have you seen in the process? I got to remember to, I hear people are still talking about the audio. So I got to remember to talk into my mic, huh? All right, we're going ahead and share this with you. So most people perceive value. Of course, that makes sense why you're here in this session, to be able to join in a session about planning, because you recognize it. At the research, as I said, consistently across the board, doing these kinds of things add value to your organization, and for a variety of those outcomes that were on that last slide. Right? Any one of those outcomes, I just don't make them up. Right? Those are outcomes that we talk about in reference to planning, and we can achieve those objectives and those outcomes, and that adds value for our organization. Thanks. That's the only ones I got. So that was our quiz from the middle of the thing to try and be able to help us stay on task and to make sure we're still here. So as I said, step one is agree on your objectives and who wants to participate. How are we going to do this? What are we going to do? I don't get into a lot of this today because I wanted to get into more tools and techniques and efforts. But a key piece is: are we doing something at this end of that little chart? Or are we doing something at this end of the chart? And why are we doing it? And a lot of times, so we were doing some planning with one of the groups we were a part of, and we didn't really have a lot in the way of, we had a mission, but we didn't really have values. And so the planning group was kind of like, you got to have some of that stuff up at the top end, or else you can't really do the stuff at the bottom end. You know, that's partly true, and it was certainly useful for us to engage in the values planning, but and it was allowed us to be able to talk about the degree to which programs were aligned with some of those values. But you can, I mean, to be honest with you, I think you can engage in both. Or one or the other. But anyhow, it's clarifying what it is that you want to try and be able to get going, and then being able to think about how we're going to do it. How much time are we going to allow? What are we going to try and be able to do? What's the sequencing of all of these things? So there's a number of questions about clarifying that. So then we're left with, that's the 3 steps, right? Outputs, and then you're left with what kind of information and processes, or what kind of structuring do we need to be able to do to help facilitate the kinds of conversations that we need to have so that we can lead to, engaging the right constituents at the right times to be able to get the information we need to be able to make some decisions. And I look for kind of 2 places to gather information. I look to inside our organization and the way we think about who we are and what we have. So there's a whole bunch of stuff about capacity of organizations. And again, I don't get into this a lot today. I'll get into it a little bit. I'll introduce these ideas about capacity. But we basically think about who we are as an organization and how we're, oftentimes how we're special, if you will, or how we're distinct, or what's unique about us. You see this a lot of times with hospitals, perhaps, right? We've all seen those billboards of the doctor as we're driving down the freeway, and it's kind of like, why are they highlighting such and such a doctor, right? Well, they're highlighting that doctor because she has the kinds of capabilities or the expertise that differentiates that hospital from another one. So thinking about how you can differentiate yourself. The other thing we'll also see, right, is staying on the hospital theme for just a minute. We have wonderful facilities, or we have these tools, or this technology, and what they want to try and be able to do is differentiate themselves from other organizations, other people doing similar kinds of things. So inevitably, right, when we're trying to do our planning at the center, right, we're saying, well, okay, who else is doing stuff? How are we special from them or distinct? So that's how are we special? Who else is doing stuff is over here, right? So strategy is always this interplay between us and them, or us and the external environment, and the way we think about who would support our work, right? Nonprofits are always having this conversation. What's the nature of the people who would support our work? What's the nature of the demand for our services and the characteristics and the gaps that need to get done? Who are the other players or the other people that are functioning out there in this space, and how do we understand who they are? So those two pieces, I'm going to give you a couple of tools now to be able to sort of work through a couple of those. So I'm starting with the real straightforward one, right? So all of you have probably been exposed to this or have heard some version of the SWOT, right? So this idea that we think a little bit about ourself, internal, what are our strengths, what are our weaknesses, what do we do really well, what about the people that we have, right? So we got this really great, doctor, or we got this really great, clinician that can provide these, whatever it is. We have a tremendous resource of voluntary labor. People seem to really just love, and they're knocking our door down in a way that they're attracted to our organization. So however we frame or think about our strengths, about the ability to be able to do what we try to be able to do, and then what's wrong with us, right? Or what's concerning us in reference to the way that we operate or function. So is it that we're having trouble with our finances? We can't seem to figure out how to be able to keep our books clean? Is it our information technology? Is it the way that we thought we could recruit volunteers, but we can't seem to recruit volunteers? So maybe it's the way we're communicating, or the way we absorb people, or what have you. So there's this conversation about our strengths and our weaknesses. And then there's the external conversation. So what do we perceive as opportunities, either in resources and our ability to be able to sustain our work, or in reference to needs? So a lot of our nonprofit organizations think almost exclusively about need or demand. There is a group of people that need this, or the environment is in this situation, and so we need to do this. So we spend a lot of our attention, and if you engaged in planning processes, a lot of what we try to do is kind of people work on the needs and the thinking about programs and delivering. So that's our impact question. But our sustainability question tends to be as important, and I venture to almost say potentially even more important, but we do really think about resources broadly. So clearly the two have to function together, and I spent quite a bit of time, several chapters, talking about these ideas about how you recognize this need for services and the nature of the resource environment. And it's a really pretty critical, you need to talk about both. I think that's the takeaway here, is that we need to talk about both our ability to be able to capture resources to address that need, right? Threats sometimes come in the demand of shifts in the way that we see need. So again, I was telling you about that example of working with the organization that's working with the elderly. And so one of the opportunities, right, is there's a tremendous growing population of individuals in the region who are aging and looking for services. But there's also a tremendous number of other providers that are providing services. So there's a lot of other people doing stuff. So it's not necessarily open space in some ways, right? There's a lot of people that are working and thinking about stuff. So this SWOT, I saw somebody made reference to the other acronyms, the scores, the SOAR, I think, is another one that somebody likes. I think you can search up SWOT and type in alternatives, and I suspect you'll find several others. And people have ones that they've used or feel like that they add a little bit more value. I just was keeping it simple today. I actually found this, as you can tell the way I talked about it, I find it pretty simple to be able to think through, and again, it works for my brain. But the reference, Teresa came up with the score: strengths, challenges, opportunities, response, and effectiveness. So yeah, she likes that one at the food bank. Like I say, something that allows you to kind of talk through a series of elements can be quite useful. And why I picked this one or went with this one is because it highlights again that internal and that external component, which I wanted to try and be able to highlight as well. I was talking with Bill. I think he's SOAR, I think, is the one that he thought was the way to go. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about the external environment, considering your relationship with external stakeholders and forces. and just kind of reference that. So, but I'm going to start with the money side, the nature or the resource market, right? So I probably should have put on, yeah, I did. Okay, so the entire portfolio of the resource streams, which includes the money, right? But it's also our ability to be able to access the right kinds of peoples and partnerships and alliances. So who is it that we work with and how do we pay for some of this stuff? Ends up being a really critical component. And so part of what I ask organizations to do is clearly describe and define what's going on with your resource portfolio. What's the nature of that resource stream? Can we talk clearly about the extent to which it's reliable, sustainable, ongoing, right? Is it turbulent, right? Is this idea that we don't know what's going on? Is it thin, right? So one of the things we talk about with organizations is how many funding sources do you have, right? So the group we're working with the elderly care, they have relatively few organizations that they solicit grant funds. So they get grant funds. It's an important part of who they are. It's roughly 20% of their revenue stream. But it comes from about 2 sources, right? And so one of the questions becomes, are there more sources? And how reliable and how stable are those 2 sources? And consistently, are they talking to you, and are you working really hard to maintain those relationships? And who's working really hard to maintain those relationships? Because we're looking for stability, right? We're looking for our ability to be able to make projections and estimate not only this year are they going to grant to us, but next year they're going to grant to us as well. And the subsequent year, they're talking about even doing more. So our ability to be able to make reasonable estimates about the extent to which resources or sustainability elements are going to be a key part of who we are. So come back to that straw analogy, right? Is the straw reasonable, or is it weak and thin and unreliable and inconsistent? So can we gather up good quality consistently year over year, or are we left with thin elements? And so this becomes a really important conversation about that idea of sustainability, because that's what we were trying to talk about. And how do we talk? And this is the area that I'd say, by and large, nonprofit organizations struggle the most with. It's the most difficult to get our hands around. It's the most competitive, right? Because you say to yourself, well, nobody's competing for low-income elderly to provide housing for them, right? Because they can't pay for it, et cetera, et cetera. How many people are competing for the resources and the funds? How many people are competing for the volunteers' time and even the attention of potential partners or grant makers to be able to get them to prioritize your issue over somebody else? So this tends to be where the competition lays out. And again, those of you who've been in this space know that. But it's really important. And then secondarily, as we identify these things and we say these are our priorities, thinking about that diagram again, how have we got in place the programmatic features that we need to be able to do that? So you think back to Crittenden's observation that part of what an organization does is they're externally oriented and they recognize the nature and character of their resource markets or their resource streams, and they have focused efforts to be able to capitalize on those. The second thing we want to try and be able to do, right, is talk clearly about who it is we serve, right? So that second component of what we want to be able to think about. What's going on in the way of the needs? Who are the people that we serve? Who are the beneficiaries that we serve? What's the nature of other providers in that element? Where do we approach them? How do we approach them? Do we approach them at a level of providing basic services? Do we provide a depth of services? So the example of I just drew the blank, but this idea of serving a kid or whether you serve the family, right? How do we think about the frame of our approach and the elements of what we're trying to be able to do? And so this idea of the Harlem Children's Zone was the example I was trying to think about. So this idea that they made a choice to focus in on a particular region and try and serve that region in depth. So how we define the nature of the needs and the nature of our focus of our work will improve our ability to have impact. So this is basic program planning fundamentals. How are we doing here? I'm starting to run out of time. That's what I was afraid of. Basic program fundamentals, but this importance of recognizing the nature of the need. I'm going to jump ahead. Just one little brief, I put these in to more or less give myself a break too, right? But I did like this one because it's just this recognition that at times we do need to let ourselves dream in the planning process, and that it can be fun to do some of that stuff. So with some sense of the external environment, how do we understand our own internal environment? And I put this in as a last minute sort of thought, but I like the competing values framework, and you'll pardon me for what it is, but it's fundamentally thinking about the operations of your organization as buffering the external environment and the internal environment. And like a good academic, we brought it up into 4 quadrants. But this idea that there are things external to our organization, and that we tend to think about them as needing a great deal of flexibility, or we think about them as being a bit more controlled or focused. So you think about service quality, for instance, right? So it's externally oriented, high quality services that are consistent and reliable over time, have an element of control features to them. I tend to put programs in here. I tend to put fundraising into this quadrant here. This is having to do with a bit more internally oriented but flexible. So they put people over here, so the human relations element here, right? So you've got this human side. Who are the people in our organization? We've got the external marketing and the communication side. We've got our program side, and we've got our sort of internal control oriented, which tends to be budgeting and finance and some of the information technology features. Why I like it is because it's simple, and it helps me think about the different quadrants of an organization. I give you a quick reference to it. Anyhow, there is an assessment related to it if you wanted it. If that appealed to you, there are lots. You type in organizational capacity and you can find a lot of information on trying to be able to assess. But fundamentally, it's coming back down to these 3 things. How well do we deliver our programs? How well do we relate to the external environment? How well do we relate to the people that are in our organization? How well do we handle the information and the internal source pieces of our organization? And those 4 key ideas play out again and again and again and again and again in regards to capacity. We can play with the nuance, we can play with specialties, we can play with focuses, we can play with efficiencies. There's all kinds of stuff you can do with this that's quite powerful and quite useful. So this gives you a lot more information than you'd ever want on that, but this is a very simple little tool that you can grab as well. One more, do I got time? Yeah, I got 10 minutes left. So I'm going to introduce one more idea for you so that you've got one more set of tools. And this has to do with a portfolio analysis. And I'm giving you 2, so I hope this doesn't bother you a little bit. But this idea, basically what we're trying to do is we think about all of the, pardon me as I jump back for just a sec. So if you think about all of the stuff that's kind of over here on this side, more or less, right? You think about all your programs, all your initiatives, even your little fundraising events, all that stuff, right? So all these things that are over here. So portfolio analysis says, can we map these a little bit and think about like how they work? And the first 2 quadrants here have to do with thinking about, in relation to others, how much do you deliver? So back to our elder care services, right? It so happens they serve low-income elderly services. It so happens that they provide quite a bit of the housing in the region. So they actually have a pretty big market share, right? So of the low-income elderly in the region, they're probably providing housing or related housing or services at the very least for 60% of the individuals in this region. So they have a pretty good share of the market, right? And then, as I said, we know that there's a potential for growth. There's an increasing number of these individuals in the region. So this is an attempt to try and think about our programs in relation to market forces or in relation to environmental forces, if the phrase market kind of throws you off and isn't that comfortable to you, but this idea of proportion of, so another example, right, in mentoring, right? So some organizations will say, we provide a lot of the mentoring care or the after school care. You can pick any one of these and say, we're basically providing most of the services or we're providing a small number of services in that area. I'm going to go on ahead and so what it says is you can map these then, so you probably may have seen this. You can map these then based on market share. So that example of the elderly housing, they had a high portion of the market share and the market is growing. This would suggest they probably should invest, right? So it's not like rocket science, but it is useful because it maps out all this stuff that's going on in your organization and all of these different activities, right? And this idea that if you're really serving a low portion of the market, serving 5% of the people in that area or that discipline, and the market's not going anywhere, right? So this is a corporate model. This basically says you might want to consider dropping these guys, right? If you've got a high market share, but the market's not really going anywhere, then probably just make sure you're doing this really efficiently, really smoothly, and really continue to gain that market share, recognizing it's probably not going to grow, right? And so you are required to figure out how to get that information about the nature of the market, right? So we were able to get the information about elderly population growth. We're able to get information about who else is providing services. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. Sometimes you can really get a good sense of it. Sometimes your market portion is pretty small. And for a lot of folks, those two variables are not all that useful. I recognize it. Or they don't tend to think about their organization in that way. But I did want to expose you to them. These next two basically are an adaptation of those same two ideas, but applied more directly to the nonprofit sector. And they call this the matrix map, as opposed to the BCG group, which did their Boston Consulting Group, which is this one here, right? So this one has to do, it's a bit more internally focused, but it has to do with, to what extent does that program basically cost you money, or is it a net revenue element for you? And to what degree is that program aligned or achieves the mission impact objectives that you're trying to be able to achieve? And so I'm going to jump to ahead. There we go. So it's a similar map, right, which is why I gave you the two of them. But the sweet spot, right, my heart, right, is programs that you can make some money or have some degree of profitability. And again, profitability could be conceptualized as a revenue stream is aligned with our ability to be able to deliver those services, right? So if you've got a consistent and reliable revenue stream, it may not be, it doesn't have to be, it's not fee-based. It doesn't have to be fee-based. It can be a reliable and consistent revenue stream to deliver this service, right? Aligned with it. So a grant that you know is going to come in every year, and they give you that grant, and you believe it's really aligned to the purposes of your organization. I should have given you the references. I'll send you the link to this, because this is a nice little tool, and there's a really simple little PDF that goes with it. It's a really useful conversation. We've done it a lot with organizations. People like it. It makes a lot of sense. It's pretty intuitive when you start to look at it. And like I say, this one really fits for people because they can begin to think about the finances. It does force you, though, to be clear about how much does it cost me to deliver these programs, right? Which is, that alone can be an important conversation for people. How much does it cost you to deliver this program? Gee, I don't know, right, exactly. And can I, right? So the trick gets to be, do I align this revenue stream? Here's what the map can look like. So this is an example of one that was done for, it looks like a after-school program, after-school tutoring, right? So that's our heart, right? it's pretty profitable. They got a nice grant. The city's paying money for it, or perhaps, or maybe they're charging a fee. Who knows? We don't know exactly what their revenue stream is. And it's right in line with what they want to try and be able to achieve. It's serving kids. It's making a difference. And the bubble sizes tend to be the size of the budget. So they actually got, oh, this one's not a heart. This is the red. So they're losing money on it, right? So that's oh yeah, we're losing money, right? Which is pretty typical, right? So then where are the ones that they're making money on, right? So they do this community festival, but they're like, it's not that great. It doesn't have that big of an impact, right? So our impact stuff over here costs us money, and that's, this is the up and down, right? Impact, yeah, after school program, profitability, yeah. So this is in the red, this is in the black, this is right. So this is losing me money every time I serve another kid in the after school program. Yeah, you're like, yeah, but you have to, right? Because that's what you do, right? Or even the summer program. So where's the money coming from? And this allows you to be able to map both the revenue models or the events or the programs or the things that happen and the extent to which those things align or don't align with the purposes of our organization. And so this tends to be high impact, this tends to be low impact for the mission, right? So it's not just impact, but it's mission in reference to who we are. I'm running out of time. I'm sorry, I talked the whole time. I hope that wasn't too much for you. Happy to chat further. You know how much I enjoy getting a kick out of all this stuff. It's important for us to remind you about some of the stuff coming up. We got our leadership and public service, so that's fun. That's a 2-day. We'll be back in person. Look forward to seeing folks here if you wanted to come by. And of course, the certificate programs will be launching next fall as well. Plenty of other stuff. Anything else, Rebecca or Paige, or questions? I'm sorry, folks, I didn't give any time for questions. I'm